Hello and welcome to the Royal Beat Book Club with me, Gareth Russell. In this series, we pull back the pages and do all the hard work for you, reviewing the best royal books in print so you know which deserve a place on your bookshelf. Today we discuss Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest-serving royal consort. Known for his straightforward demeanour and at times his controversial remarks, he's a public figure that has been and continues to be of great interest. He carried out more than 22,000 solo royal engagements, he was associated with almost 1,000 charities, and he kept working until he was 96. To discuss his fascinating life, I'm delighted to be joined by Ailsa Anderson, the former Communications Secretary to Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Kate Mansey, Assistant Editor at The Times, and royal biographer Ian Lloyd, whose book, The Duke, 100 Chapters in the Life of Prince Philip, uncovers things we didn't know about him. Well, let's begin. You all had the pleasure of meeting Prince Philip. Obviously, Ailsa, you'll know much more than that, but what was your impressions of meeting the man himself?
Well, mine's funny. I covered the Queen's 1994 state visit to Russia, and there was a press reception, and I didn't know many of the press there, so I was standing at this reception with a glass of mildly warm white wines pressed against the wall on my own Billy No-Mates, and Prince Philip spotted me across the room, and I could see him look like that, felt really sorry for me, came striding across the room, which parted like the Red Sea. And he got up to me and he looked at my badge and it said Ian Lloyd, photographer, and he just went, huh, turned around and went all the way back. And I was really upset, but then I spoke to Piers Morgan and he did exactly the same to Piers Morgan. So I think, you know, I thought, well, it's a press reception, you would expect press there, but didn't get very good, nothing else.
Do you remember the first time you met him? Or is there a memory that kind of sticks in your head?
For me, I just think he was a man ahead of his time, really. I think, you know, going back to receptions, when he was talking to people, and you could be a countess or somebody who worked behind a counter, and he would treat everybody the same, and he could have that amazing ability to make you feel you were the most special person in the room, almost like, you know, a lighthouse was beaming on you. So most of the memories I had, almost all the memories I had of him were warm and you know, genuine. You know, an incredibly impressive individual.
Well, we've got, I mean, this sort of sets it up perfectly for me. We've got a wonderful mixture here, sort of personal and press here. And he did have, I mean, quite a complicated relationship with the press, didn't he?
He did, as Ian sort of hinted at there. I think, you know, I remember meeting him at a press reception at Buckingham Palace for the first time years ago. And he was just very curious. He was very interested in everybody around. There was a kind of smattering of press in amongst other people. And I was introduced to him. And he always had the questions, you know, that it's the old kind of joke, isn't it, about the royal family. They always say, well, how, you know, have you come far? But he was genuinely curious, and everybody he met, right up until he, you know, he stopped work, that there was never any kind of flagging at all. He had this tremendous energy. He used to stand there with his hands behind his back, kind of rocking backwards and forwards on his heels, which is something Princess Anne does, actually, when she's in a good mood. And it was him, you know, he was asking, where are you from? What do you do? He wanted to know everything about you, and throwing in bits and pieces that, oh, I've been there and such and such. So it was a real kind of it was a real energising force, I think, for the Queen.
I couldn't agree more, and it's funny what you said. I mean, also, if you were behind on your brief and you didn't know the answers, he would absolutely call you up. So you had to be absolutely spot on about what advice you were giving, what, you know, what information you were giving to him, because he would call you out if you weren't on your game.
Well, let's take a look at him before this, before he was the royal consort and before the Queen. He had a very complex childhood, which you cover, Ian, in your book. And I think, I mean, certainly he had a very blissful childhood for the first 9 years, and then things start to take a really quite tragic and dark turn. Can you talk about that?
Well, he was born on the island of Corfu, and there was a war between Greece and Turkey, so they had to get out. So George V, the late Queen's grandfather, sent a gunboat. They were taken to, first of all, England, then to Paris, where he was based for 7 or 8 years. As a family, there was Philip with 4 older sisters. He must have been spoilt rotten as a baby, but it all went pear-shaped in the year 1930, 30 to 31, because his mother had a nervous breakdown. The 4 sisters all got married within 9 months, unbelievably, and they all married German aristocracy or princes, went to Germany. His mother went into a sanatorium. We're probably going to talk about that. But his father went with a mistress to Monte Carlo. So the family home broke up. And for the 1930s, Philip spent the time either with his grandmother at Kensington Palace or his two uncles, George Milford Haven and Lord Louis Mountbatten. So he was shunted around from pillar to post, really.
Well, to talk, I mean, you touched upon it, about that, I mean, really kind of tragic case of his mother, Princess Alice, that she suffered what we would now recognise to be a pretty severe mental health episode. And, what's happening in the history of mental health at the minute is quite fascinating, where we're starting to ask questions, and I think this pertains to Prince Philip's mother. Were there many people in the past who had an episode, an incident that was really severe, and the treatment they were then subjected to helped prolong or even exacerbate the causes? So what happened to Princess Alice?
Well, in the late 1920s, she became deeply religious and then started to have fantasies. She believed that she was married to Jesus Christ and all these kind of odd beliefs. And when things got really difficult, her mother entered her into a sanatorium in Germany, and she was diagnosed in those days with the wonderful phrase paranoid schizophrenic, which you wouldn't now. And the awful thing was that Sigmund Freud, the psychologist, was brought in, and he diagnosed the fact that she had unrequited crush, he was told, on a mysterious man. We don't know who it was, but he believed her libido was high, and that the cure for it was to have X-rays on her ovaries to bring on the menopause. And, it was kind of a very harsh treatment. She came back, she wasn't, as it were, cured, so she went to another sanatorium in Switzerland where she was for 2 years. So it was quite a harsh regime.
And obviously, I'm sure, heartbreaking for people who knew her. I mean, Ailsa, do you ever remember him talking about this, or did Prince Philip talk about this in later life?
I never, ever heard him speak, but I don't know whether that's a generational thing. People of that age don't really open up about their emotions. And he was, he's a former military officer. He was a consort. He's very much let's not talk about feelings, let's just get on and do it. So, no, I never heard him speak.
And it's not as if, I mean, in that kind of emotional gap that he had, that his father, Prince Andrew, really stepped into the breach. I mean, he was pretty absent from Prince Philip's life, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. Although the nice thing about Prince Philip, he never sort of accused his parents of anything. Prince Andrew died in 1942 in Monte Carlo during the height of the war, so Philip wasn't there. And it wasn't until after the war that he went to pick up his few rather pathetic things. And one was a suit which Philip wore, and his shaving kit, which again Philip used, and a signet ring, which again Prince Philip wore. So he rather than rejecting the memory of his father, he kind of embraced it, if you like. And the same with his mother. She spent the last 2 years of her life, 1967 to 69, at Buckingham Palace. She was in Greece living alone, and he actually got the Queen to invite her because he knew she would never reject that offer. But so she spent the last 2 years here with him looking after her, I suppose.
Well, we also see here his parents are in happier times, and he did name his second son with the name Andrew. So it's interesting to see how he kept their memories alive within the royal family.
And Princess Anne is Anne Elizabeth, Alice, Louise.
So how do you think that those early experiences shaped the man he became?
Well, it must have done, because it was so sort of upsetting. I mean, it would these days, of course, he would have had counselling and all kinds of things, but I think his attitude then in the 30s and coping with it all was, well, you either sink or swim, and he decided to swim. So it sort of bolstered his belief in himself and developing himself as a personality. So he wasn't fond of looking back, and he never ever said, oh, poor me. But it kind of it made him quite I think it probably accounts for his prickly character, the fact he was quite hiding a lot of private thoughts, I suppose.
There was, of course, an appalling tragedy that happened in 1937 that did help bring Prince Philip's family back together again, but it was heartbreaking in the extreme, even by the standards of any family bereavement. His pregnant sister, Cecily, was killed in an aeroplane crash while flying to Britain, but she was also killed with her husband and two of their children. that is an immense tragedy for anyone at such a young age to undergo. But there was a particularly nasty detail that was woven into the legend of the plane crash that killed the pregnant Grand Duchess Cecily, which was that she was coming to see Philip, which was not the case at all, but it sort of put him uncomfortably at the centre of...
It happened because of him.
Yes,
sort of
exactly.
thing, yeah.
And actually, I'm sure many of our viewers will remember that was a major plot point in season 2 of the Netflix series The Crown. And from my own perspective, I remember watching that episode and thinking, gosh, that was the first time I felt that The Crown had gone from season 1, where it was sticking as closely as it seemed to be able to the record, to going into an area that it would later be quite stridently criticised for, where it seemed unnecessary or even cruel. There's that horrible bit where they have him dreaming of the plane crash and seeing the bodies. I mean, really horrible, horrible imagery. But allegedly, Prince Philip was actually quite upset when he heard that Netflix had used the storyline that Cecily was coming to see him because he had been misbehaving at school or something. So you wonder, were there these wounds stayed deep within him, and they could still hurt? Well,
I was told that there's an aristocrat called Gina Kennard. I don't know whether you remember her. No, she was. I can't remember the relationship. I know she was at the Duke of Westminster's daughter's wedding. I think she was the grandmother of the present Duke of Westminster, and. She was a childhood friend of Philip's, and she said that she remembered him coming to stay, and out of his pocket he pulled a little bit of the wreckage of the plane that he'd been given, I suppose. And she said she always regretted the fact that she never hugged him or anything. You know, just as children, you stand there looking and commenting about it. But that was his way of sort of coping with it. But it must have been awful. You know, I mean, what was he, 16? And apparently she was the favourite sister. And, you know, he was traumatised. But there are photographs of him walking behind her coffin. And it's supposed to be that influenced him to mention to William and Harry about they might welcome the opportunity to walk behind Diana's coffin in 1997, you know, that he found that of some kind of release, I suppose, or help, you know.
And of course, the Crown is a drama, and it will have things for dramatised effect. But it does give an idea of the impact of the show, that it helped reignite discussion of this airplane crash decades after it happened.
Well, that's right. There's people who are learning that story for the first time while watching it on television on The Crown. So that's and it's, you know, huge multi-million pound budgets. It's very realistic. It's very well done. I think it's quite beguiling, isn't it, to think that that's how it happened. But there was definitely a kind of shift that they put on it, the slant that they put on it, that it was Philip's fault. He'd done something wrong at school. That's why the sister was coming over to visit him, and that's when the tragedy happened. Ergo, it was his fault, which isn't true. But it must have been very damaging, I think, for him as a child. But it's fascinating to think all the things he went through as a young boy, even as a baby. There's a story of him being, you know, evacuated in an orange crate, and Ian will know the story better than me. During the turbulence of the war that was going on when he was so young, and that's why they had to move to Paris. But he was of that generation where, you know, he didn't speak, as Ailsa says, you know, didn't speak about it, he bottled it all, you know, so that that was his way of coping, I guess.
There's a story that Cecile, that was killed in the plane crash, she had a daughter who didn't go on the aircraft. She remained in Germany. And
she was very young, Joanna or something,
Joanna,
a toddler
yes.
or something.
And so the family were coming over for a wedding, and the couple that got married didn't have children, so they adopted the little girl. This was Philip's niece, and then tragically she died of an illness a few years later. So, you know, there was an ongoing tragedy really.
Well, The Crown also famously picked up with a much happier event in Prince Philip's life, and in fact it was its opening storyline, which was his marriage to Princess Elizabeth, and it was a very different marriage to his parents. But when did they first meet, Ian? What was their first encounters?
Well, the books always say that the first time they remembered meeting was at Dartmouth in July of 1939. On the eve of war, the King, Queen and the two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, went to Dartmouth. Philip was a cadet there, and there was an outbreak of mumps, so the girls were segregated. They weren't allowed to see any of the other people, but Philip was brought in to sort of entertain them. And I think he was probably very bored because he would be 18 and Elizabeth was a very young 13, but she's supposed to have looked at him and he showed off. He jumped over the tennis nets and things like that, and she never took her eyes off him. But they had met before. They'd met in 1934 at the coronation, at the wedding of George, Duke of Kent, to Princess Marina of Greece, who was Philip's cousin, and at the coronation of George VI, but they apparently don't remember that, or didn't remember it. But so it was Dartmouth that kicked it off, I suppose.
Whilst they very much did click, I don't think it's telling tales out of school to say that not everyone in the palace, or indeed in Elizabeth's own family, were equally enthused with Prince Philip when he first appeared on the scene as a potential romantic interest. Well,
I think they were very suspicious about his uncle, Louis Mountbatten, because Mountbatten had been a great friend of Edward VIII, later Duke of Windsor, as Prince of Wales. And the minute that Edward abdicated in 1936, he jumped ship and tried to be best friends with George VI and Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother's supposed to have said, we always treated Dickie with a pinch of salt. I mean, she knew exactly what he was like. But it was always felt that he'd orchestrated this marriage between Philip and Elizabeth. And in 1940, Philip was on a ship, HMS Ramillies, and he said to the captain that my uncle, Dickie, would like me to marry Princess Elizabeth. I mean, he was only, a teenager still then. So it was felt but they thought he was too young, and the Queen Mother, as Queen Elizabeth, had, I was told by a member of the staff, what they call a cricket 11, which was this batting order. And this batting order was the future Dukes of Grafton, Buccleuch, one at Blenheim, what's that? Marlborough. All these various English dukes. She wanted him to marry a nice, sensible English duke, but Prince Philip wasn't on the list.
Well, before the Queen Mother had drawn up her first 11 for future royal consorts, they had actually invited Prince Philip often to visit the family, and particularly to spend Christmas with them. And it's allegedly that there was a pantomime at Windsor that really helped accelerate things for Prince Philip in terms of his feelings for Elizabeth.
Yeah, during the war, they exchanged, Elizabeth and Philip exchanged what they call cousinly letters.
This is the pantomime here, allegedly,
that's right. That's
Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were part of.
That's Aladdin, and as you see, Princess Margaret was always the beautiful princess in it, and the Queen was always the principal boy. And this particular one, as we said earlier, Philip didn't have a home, you see, so he spent Christmas holidays and shore leave when he was in the Navy with various relatives. This particular leave he spent at Windsor Castle. The princesses did a pantomime every year. 1943 was Aladdin. Philip was in the audience. Elizabeth was, transitioning from a teenager into a woman, and what he couldn't get over were her fantastic legs. It reminds me a bit later of William with Kate Middleton and the fashion show at St Andrews. The catwalk thing. There was Philip on the front row. Watching this thing and thinking, my goodness, look at this beautiful girl, And
the king actually wanted the outfit changed beforehand, didn't he?
Yeah, he was very worried that
protective father.
He was like going around with a tape measure, sort of saying this is far too, short and everything like that. And I mean that's the revised version, so it must have been quite short. But anyway, that was early December of '43, and then the Queen Mother, or Queen Elizabeth, invited Philip to stay for Christmas. So he went back and then came back for Christmas. And they said that's the moment it clicked. That's when he knew. At this point, the royal family, members of the royal household, know about this romance. But when did the British public find out? Oh, not till, I think the public found out in about 1946. One of the things that sort of kicked that off was the wedding of the future Countess Mountbatten, Patricia Knatchbull, who was the daughter, his first cousin. She was the daughter of Lord Louis Mountbatten. She got married in, I think it was October of '46. Elizabeth was a bridesmaid, and Philip was a groom, an usher, I think. But his job was to meet the bridesmaids, and Elizabeth was wearing a mink wrap or something, and he took that off her. And everybody, noted that they were kind of, more than just guests at a wedding. There was definitely something there. And that's when it was picked up by the papers, I think. This is their engagement photograph from 1947. And amongst the other details being discussed, Kate, was the fact that they were actually very distantly related.
Well, that's right, yeah. They were distantly related. And I think There is this, as you know better than anyone, Gareth, there's this history of, you know, members of the royal family marrying foreign members of royal families and things like that. But there's, you know, sufficient distance between that relation that it was all okay. But Dickie Mountbatten's role in it is all very interesting as well. He wasn't one of the top 11, as Ian says, in that batting order. But, you know, Dickie Mountbatten did a very good job. He got his man into the prime position. And, you know, you can see they're both... he's a very dashing Royal Navy officer at the time, and you know, obviously she was incredibly beautiful. So I should imagine a lot of the work did itself, and Dickie probably didn't have too much of a hand to play in it, to be honest.
There was quite a bit of backlash from the public as well. I mean, yes, there certainly had
That's
been
right.
There had been quite a bit of history of royalty marrying foreign royalty, but that had kind of died out. In Elizabeth's parents' generation, they had, apart from Princess Marina, but they really had been marrying British aristocrats, and there was resentment about, you know, is Philip Greek, is he German, but that people probably would have preferred one of the Queen Mother's cricket team for the choice. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, there was certainly one opinion poll by, I think the paper's still around, I think it's a tabloid now, but it would have been that they did this opinion poll that most people felt that she should have married an Englishman. And the word foreign, at the time, foreign crops up. I mean, the Queen's cousin, Margaret Rhodes, said apparently that, you know, people regarded him as a foreign interloper who was out for the goodies, meaning that, you know, he's quite, by royal standards, quite impoverished. So, you know, that there was a feeling, is he kind of using the position to get a lot of money, to get stability or whatever? But the word foreign keeps cropping up, as it did actually with Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. If you look back, I mean, he was vilified, I mean, because, and everybody talked to then about he was impoverished and foreign, you know. And the foreignness, I think we even see now with Meghan Markle. I'm sure that was one of the reasons that she had problems adjusting to royal life, because she's perceived as a foreigner, and people would prefer, perhaps it's the insularity of the British or the English that you want. A nice.
I think back in that day as well, you know, Britain's coming out of the war, and in that context as well, there's a lot of kind of societal change, and you know, it's hard to imagine now what that was like. You know, so many families had lost loved ones in that war.
And talking of the war, I mean, 3 of his sisters were associated with the Nazi Party. I mean, his
Having said that, he served with the Royal Navy. You know,
and was a war hero.
Yeah, and was mentioned in dispatches. Yeah.
There was one particular battle in Italy where they worked out he was actually fighting his brother-in-law, because Prince Christoph of Hesse was in the SS, and he was fighting with the Germans in Italy, and Philip, of course, you know, was stationed with the Navy, you know. So it's
interesting, because apparently he did have quite a strained relationship with the Nazi brothers-in-law, because when Philip had started his education, this is a boarding school in Germany, it was run by a Jewish headmaster called Kurt Hahn, who becomes so significant in Philip's life. And the Nazis ordered Hahn's arrest, and he fled to Britain, where he founded Gordonstoun, and Philip chose to leave Germany and go to Scotland to continue his education with Hahn, which obviously, with just how rabidly anti-Semitic the Nazi Party were, made the brothers-in-law very angry. So it's interesting that you see Philip kind of sticking to his guns really early. That's a big thing for a teenager to do, to kind of go up against the family.
And brave.
Very brave, I think so, because of the pressure, particularly if, you know, you are someone who's been adrift from family and your sisters are your family anchor, to go against their brothers, I think took real heft of spirit. And on the subject of sort of sticking to their guns, it really is an early indication, isn't it, of who Elizabeth II will be in opposition to this marriage, that she just will not back down. Philip is the man she wants.
That's right. I think it shows something about the mettle of both their characters, doesn't it? The fact that they were very sure about themselves. I think before the engagement was announced, Princess Elizabeth kept a picture of Philip by her bedside, I'm told. And, you know, even in that run-up, there was discussion. I think the King wanted to delay that announcement of the engagement until he felt that the time was right. And, you know, his we four, as he called them, and his pride and joy, Elizabeth and Margaret, saying goodbye to the older one, I think was a bit of a, or certainly was tough, wasn't it, for George VI?
Well, I think also Elizabeth was the one that was most like him, and dutiful and serious, but with a you know, sharp wit and everything. I think Margaret was. They all said Elizabeth was his pride and Margaret was his joy, but Margaret, you know, she was a completely different character. But George VI was very similar to Elizabeth, and he didn't want to lose her at all, I don't think.
They obviously saw something in each other, and it's interesting you saying that they didn't get on with some of the courtiers weren't best pleased about him coming into the fold like that. But the fact that he could, he found joy in things, and he found a sense of humour in even the smallest things, and I'm sure that's one of the things that the young Princess Elizabeth loved about him. He was different.
Absolutely, but even
Very dashing.
Even in his latter years, he was still absolutely charming and handsome and charismatic. When I first met him, I thought, wow. Yeah, he really, really was, to the end.
Margaret Rose told me this story. There was a bit of a rhyme going around London society that said, "Come into my arms, you bundle of charms, Philip Mountbatten RN." He was a pin-up. I mean, an absolutely gorgeous guy. So, I mean, she's bound to.
But you can see the chemistry with these images here of them both together.
Yeah, there's no hiding that look, is it?
And also, I mean, it's interesting that we talk about these kind of movie star good looks, the military service. He is a war hero at the end of the Second World War, but that does also lead to having a bit of a reputation as a ladies' man that followed him throughout his life. Was that something that was justified, Ailsa, or was that something that he felt was unfair?
I've never heard him comment about it at all. I would suspect he would think it's unfair. But if you start rebutting, you're creating a story of your own making. So I think he was ignore it, get on with life, get on with duty, get on with what you're meant to be doing, rather than listening to gossip and innuendo.
And how did that gossip and innuendo affect his wife, Elizabeth?
Again, I've never heard her speak of it, but of course any couple who hears something about their spouse which is unsavoury is not going to like it, are they?
It's interesting, his cousin, Lady Pamela Hicks, said that, of course it wasn't pleasant, but Elizabeth wasn't threatened at all. And there really wasn't, if you consider, I suppose, just how under the microscope the royals were, there was never really any evidence at all linking him to other women after his marriage.
No, I mean, speaking as a journalist, that would have been a great story, wouldn't it? But I don't think anybody ever, ever did a story like that because, yeah, like you say, there's no evidence to support it. And, they did live separately, in times, but I think that's quite common in members of the royal family. Even now, Camilla and Charles maintain separate homes, so Camilla still has Ray Mill. Does that mean anything? No, it just means they have the space to, pursue their own quiet time sometimes.
To talk about his historical legacy, or his national legacy, I suppose, we often hear historians say that the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was central to creating the stability and success of George VI's reign. But Philip arguably had the same role with Elizabeth II, didn't he? I mean, what kind of role do you think he played, Ian, in making Elizabeth II's reign the success that it was?
Well, the problem is if you're a queen regnant, which she was, you don't have the equivalent. You don't have a king, whereas as we have now, you have got a king and a queen. And Prince Philip said when the Queen came to the throne is that there are certain things that people would go to a queen for in the family, and certain things, obviously, for the king, the political stuff and so on. But when there's just the Queen, like Queen Elizabeth II, everybody goes to her, So, for instance, when there was a state banquet, as you know, the Queen would walk around and examine the tables and all that, which perhaps a Queen would have done, a Queen consort would do. There's different roles. With that, there was no role for him, so he had to carve out a role. But I think he did that to the best of his ability. And to me, I think, although there's not a king or there's not the equivalent of a queen, I think he was there as that equivalent, and I don't think she would have done that job as well without him. I think
I agree with that.
Well, she said that very openly, didn't she, Kate, at one point? She gave a speech in which she said it would have been impossible without him. Yeah,
and she described him as her strength and stay all those years. I think what was interesting carving out the role was that Philip read Prince Albert's autobiography, and he, in that, he talked about, it was described how he created his own role, because that was the only real blueprint, wasn't it? And then Philip looked at that and said, well, that's okay, that's all well and good, but in Victoria's reign, things are quite different. Now I'm working within an institution where I have to appease all these courtiers and things like that. So it was he felt that it was quite different. I remember one of the first things that he did was take on a kind of charitable role for creating and safeguarding playing fields for young children, and there was a video that he did alongside that, which you think, look at Prince of Wales and what he's doing now. That's a very similar sort of thing, putting out a video about one of your charitable enterprises. So he was really the kind of pioneer for that. He created that whole role for himself.
I totally agree. I think he was a man ahead of his time. And I remember being a very new press officer in the royal household and being shown around the Windsor farms. And the sort of manager of the farm came and showed me these water beds that the prince had installed for the cows to actually increase milk flow. And you just think, oh my goodness, this is bonkers, cows on water beds. But it was absolutely proved true. And again, it's somebody ahead of his time. And people have said to me, the Queen may have been the head of state, but he was the head of the family. And that was the role that he carved from himself as well. And
it wasn't a role that he expected when he first married Princess Elizabeth, because I don't think either of them expected that she would come to the throne so soon. I remember Michael Parker, the comment from Michael Parker, the friend and aide, who broke the news to Philip in Kenya, where they were at the treetops, that King George VI had died. And he said he looked like, a whole weight had kind of fallen on him. He had to make that decision to come out of the forces and do just reinvent the wheel, essentially, with being
and also,
Prince
I was
Consort.
told that he would have gone all the way in the Royal Navy. He wasn't just going to stay in that sort of middle-ranking role. He could have gone and become First Sea Lord. So to give that up, and especially a man like he was, to walk 3 steps behind the Queen, must have been really tricky.
Ailsa, he also had a very sensitive side that apparently he went to sort of lengths to hide, perhaps generationally. What did you see of that sensitive side of him?
I did. I think probably what I most observed were the people who worked for him were fiercely loyal. And he had one private secretary, Sir Brian McGrath, do you remember him? Who actually retired and then came back to work for Prince Philip 1 day a week. So basically he couldn't get rid of him.
It was his dog, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And the young female secretaries absolutely adored him and would work morning, noon and night to support him. So that intense loyalty that people had for him was, you can't make that up. You can't, that's not forced. It was absolutely genuine. And I remember another story. One of his protection officers, his son was in hospital, and Prince Philip phoned the hospital to find out what the sitrep was, how the child was doing. So again, he didn't have to do that, but he wanted to. So it's all those things that he didn't want glory for or praise for. He just did it because it was the right thing to do.
He also seems to have been someone who could really pour out more emotion on paper. There's some beautiful letters that he sent to his in-laws, when he knew they were having these doubts, and he talks about Lilibet for him is everything. And you do get such a sense of the sentiment that he was capable of, but he also seems to have been someone who wanted to be useful. And throughout his life, he was dedicated to so much public service, probably best known for the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. I did not do mine.
I did.
Did you? In a move that will shock no viewer, I was more into choir and drama.
Me too.
To my shame, I did not do the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, but they're a colossal achievement, aren't they? I mean, they're just huge. And the millions of people, I think, have passed through them. Again, not myself. But there is that synthesis, I think, of a lot of his interests. The countryside, the outdoors, young people, self-sufficiency, but also kind of the bonds that you make through these. And those were all issues and values that seem to really matter to him.
Yes, absolutely. And it's really legacy making. Of course, now Prince Edward is Duke of Edinburgh, and he's continuing on this amazing legacy that Prince Philip started.
We've talked about that quite serious and sentimental and useful side of him, but he was also quite a prolific, practical joker, apparently. Can you talk a little bit about his sort of sense of humour?
Golly, I think people, certainly the media, often used to say, gaffe-prone Philip. He'd make a remark and it would just be spun out of control. What I saw was actually the reverse. He would say something to put people at their ease. So they've got something to say and comment about. So it's not about him being difficult or detrimental. It's actually him trying to put people at their ease.
And the person who did, yeah, absolutely, I'd agree with that. And the person he did that to the most was the Queen.
Absolutely.
And really, and well, for argument's sake, after the coronation, she came back wearing the crown, and the first thing apparently he said to her was, "Where did you get that hat?" And it just diffused the situation if she was ever concerned about something. We saw it with the Diamond Jubilee, when he had to go to hospital for a bladder infection, if you remember.
I was there.
Of course you were, you were in the palace, and all of a sudden the Queen looked a little bit unsure and just didn't have the same kind of presence that we were used to seeing from her. She was concerned about Philip, but more than that, he was her, her rock. He was the one who was there, cracking a joke.
Yeah.
And I've seen him with
and
people
sharing the load.
with. Yeah.
He was the only one that could talk to her as an equal, if you like. I mean, Countess Mountbatten told me this great story about Prince Philip driving through Cowdray Park and with the Queen as a passenger and Earl Mountbatten in the back. And as they were, bombing down these little country lanes, he was far too fast. And every time he got to a bend, he'd slam on the brakes. And as he did so, the Queen would go, to intake of breath. And he just said, "Look, for God's sake, if you don't stop doing that, I'm going to pull up the car and throw you out," like that. And after that, she was very quiet. And when they got out, Earl Mountbatten said to her, "Do you really think he should talk to you like that?" And she said, "But he would throw me out." And it's, the only person that could actually do that to the Queen.
Ian, you have a great story in the book, and this is not a sentence that I thought I'd be saying, but it's about Princess Alexandra of Greece and some wild pigs. So what was the practical joke that Prince Philip played?
That's when he was a teenager, and they were at this stately home in Germany, the Landgrave of Hesse, and some distant relative. And I think all the adults were sitting like we're sitting around here having tea on the lawn outside. Nice, beautiful summer's day in the mid-1930s. Philip was a naughty teenager, and he took his cousin Alexandra of Greece, who later became the Queen of Yugoslavia, to see the pigs, said, "Let's go and entertain ourselves." And they opened the door thinking it'd be great if the pigs got out like that. And of course, the fat, lazy pigs wouldn't budge. So Prince Philip got a pointed stick and went into the backside of the pigs. And of course, they panic bolted, and they all shot out straight for the tea party that was on the lawn. So the cups went flying, people were running off screaming, and that was the sort of naughty tricks.
Well, at the sight of more blue bloods running away faster than they had since the Russian Revolution, he never quite seemed to fall out of his flair for ruffling feathers. There's a good story you have also about Michael Ball at the Royal Variety performance.
Yeah, that was the Golden Wedding one, 1997, and the whole thing was to honour their Golden Wedding. This was the Royal Variety, and supposedly their favourite musical after the war was Oklahoma, which they went to see a lot. And there's a song in it called "People Will Say We're in Love," which was supposed to be their song. I mean, it's pretty indisputable. Everybody knows that story. So they got Michael Ball to sing it with, I can't remember the lady's name now, but she was in the original Broadway cast. And they flew her over from America to sing this beautiful duet together. And there wasn't a dry eye in the, in the theatre. And of course, at the meet and greet, backstage, Philip said, "Oh, well, you're the chap that sang that song, that it's supposed to be our song, isn't it?" And he said, "Yes, sir." Never heard the damn thing in my life.
Well, above all, Prince Philip had dedicated his life to his wife and also to her reign. Do you think, Kate, that Prince Philip will be a standard or an example that future consorts will look at?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's beyond shadow of a doubt the most important consort I think the country's seen. He was so instrumental to the reign. And it's interesting talking about how much he supported the Queen, but just looking at him, that role and marrying Princess Elizabeth was so important for him as well, that he's, it kind of made him the man that we all know and remember. And this kind of duty of honouring him, I think, actually, people will come in years to come will pay tribute to him and the work that he did for the nation, because that is for sure a blueprint if we ever have a Queen Charlotte or whatever it may be in the future of the Waleses, or further down the line, that what Prince Philip did and the way in which he did it, the panache with which he did it, will be certainly something to follow for future generations.
Well, Ailsa, if you were to sum up the man that you knew, I'm sure that's quite a difficult question, but what is your abiding impression of Prince Philip, both the prince and the man?
I think unique. We will not see one kind of those again, certainly not our lifetimes.
Ian, you've written about him. You've written a great book on Prince Philip's life. there are stories that sometimes he did worry about that earlier criticism of him, that he'd be remembered as a foreign prince. But we've heard, both personally and constitutionally, that there's a room for a very positive legacy for Prince Philip. Do you think that will be the legacy he has, or do you think some of his concerns were justified?
Yeah, I think it will be seen positively. I think that certainly when he was 50, he said he had no idea about his legacy. He was always very not prone to talk about what that would be. He did fear, I think, privately that he would be seen as, you know, an impoverished foreign prince that came over and made gaffes and had affairs and things like that. I think he thought that's what the press would concentrate on, but they don't seem to have been. I think what struck me with his passing and the passing of the Queen is it's that generational thing that we're losing, the Second World War generation, and all it stood for, which was a sense of humour, devotion to king and country, self-sacrifice, you know, duty, as I said, to the country. You know, but we're kind of losing that as an instinctive thing. I think the Queen and Philip, their main aim was to serve, wasn't it? So I think that's what we'll look back on. They were the last figures of that particular time.
And Kate, from the perspective of someone who's in the press, and we're in, as you say, this transitional stage of monarchy, how would you sum up Prince Philip?
I think is a man of integrity and a man of duty, first and foremost, because he was true to himself. He was true to the monarchy. He was true to the country. I think he maintained that sense of humour throughout. You know, even people who knew him right towards the end of his life, he was still cracking jokes, and it was that kind of. In some ways, you know, he worried about being dubbed the foreign prince, but in many ways, he embodied all those things that we hold dear to ourselves as British citizens. You know, that kind of blitz spirit mentality, the kind of keep calm and carry on that we've known to come to associate with the royal family, and that's how he'll be remembered, I'm sure. And I think some of the, you know, even nowadays, you know, he looked at the kind of mental health, you know, initiatives that William and Harry were doing, and he was slightly bemused by them. And I think he was proud, obviously very proud of them. But for him, it was about just kind of putting oneself, you know, for last, pushing everything down, and just getting on with the task at hand, which I think was why he loved all that kind of outdoor sports. He loved Gordonstoun. He liked being useful, you know, like Ian said, and that's how we'll remember him.
Well, 20th century Britain was a country very well served by its royal consorts. Prince Philip was the longest royal serving consort in our country's history, and I would agree, I think probably one of the most impactful and certainly the most dedicated. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much to our wonderful guests, Ian, Ailsa and Kate. Ian's book, The Duke, 100 Chapters in the Life of Prince Philip, is out wherever you get your books from, and it really does deserve a place on your bookshelf.